The gym at Fort Emerson was already buzzing when Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn walked in just past 0600s. The overhead fluorescents cast their usual sterile glow across the rubber floors, catching on dumbbells, jump ropes, and the sheen of sweat that came standard with military ambition. Martha didn't make an entrance. She didn't need to. At 45, her steps were quiet, measured, like someone who'd long since learned that strength didn't need volume. Her PT shirt was faded to near gray, the Army logo barely visible after hundreds of washes. The boots on her feet weren't parade polished, but they were well worn, leather shaped by miles of terrain, most of which didn't appear on any official map. She moved like someone who didn't have anything to prove. But as it turned out, she'd be proving plenty. Behind the front desk, a young corporal named Eddie Palmer barely looked up from his roster tablet. "Thumbprint for check-in," he muttered, gesturing at the scanner. "Wait for the green light." Martha pressed her thumb down. The machine blinked, processed, and turned green. Eddie glanced at the name, then blinked again. Like it sounded familiar, but just out of reach. "You on the sparring list?" he asked, sounding more confused than curious. "I was told I was cleared," Martha replied evenly. No attitude. "Just a fact," he shrugged. "Go on in, gear checks on the left." As Martha moved toward the sparring mats, her boots made a soft echo against the concrete, one of the few sounds that didn't try to draw attention. She set her duffel bag down near a corner wall and unzipped it with quiet precision. No wasted movement, no need for performance, just habit. But across the gym, 3 reservists noticed her the moment she walked in. Ryan McCall, Jake Tovey, and Derek Stanton were in their late 20s. All muscle, swagger, and that brand of cocky energy you only get from people who'd never been tested outside a classroom or training range. They leaned against the weight bench, each playing to the unspoken competition of who's the alpha, until Martha Quinn entered their line of sight. "Well now?" McCall smirked, elbowing Tovey. "Did someone's mom get lost on her way to the base chapel?" Tovey snorted. "Definitely admin. Bet she writes more emails than reports." "Look at those sleeves. Logistics, no doubt," Stanton added, lifting a weight with unnecessary flair. "Paper soldier. Probably has a certificate for typing speed in her desk." They chuckled. The kind of easy, careless laughter men use when they think nobody who matters is listening. Martha said nothing. She began wrapping her wrists in black hand cloth, worn soft from use. Her fingers moved automatically, winding with practiced efficiency. The cloth shifted slightly as she wrapped, revealing something beneath. Faint vertical lines burned into the skin of her forearms. Not ink, not tattoos. Scars, sharp, even permanent. Tovey's grin faltered. He squinted. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, voice laced with manufactured charm. "This isn't the senior center aerobics class." Martha didn't even look up. "Good," she replied calmly. "Those are usually too easy." That silenced them, but only for a second. "Okay? That's cute," Stanton said, forcing a laugh. "But this isn't yoga. This is combatives training." "I wasn't planning on sitting down," she answered without missing a beat. Something in her tone shifted the air. Not loud, not sharp, but decisive, like a knife sliding quietly from a sheath. McCall stepped forward, puffing his chest. "No disrespect, ma'am, but you might be in over your head. This isn't for beginners." That's when Martha finally looked up. Her eyes locked on his, calm, unblinking. And suddenly, Ryan McCall wasn't so sure of himself. "Then it should be interesting," she said. The sleeve on her right arm shifted again. Now all 3 men saw the burned, tally marks clearly, 9 of them, clean, precise, spaced like they were measured with calipers. Derek's voice cracked slightly. "What's with the wrist art? Kill count," Tovey muttered, trying to sound like he was joking, but no one laughed. Martha stood. Her posture was relaxed but controlled. "Let me know when you want to find out what they really mean," she said softly. And with that, she turned toward the mats. Suddenly, the 3 men weren't grinning. Not quite smirking. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was something else. Something they couldn't name yet. But they were starting to feel it in the pit of their stomachs. The gym's atmosphere had shifted. They had assumed they were the apex predators in the room, but something told them the real danger had just quietly taken off her compression sleeves. Martha Quinn didn't respond to the jabs. Not with words, not with a glance. She simply went about her business, unpacking her duffel bag in the same deliberate, quiet manner that marked everything she did. The hand wraps she pulled out were nothing fancy, just black cloth, worn thin and soft with age, rolled carefully like they mattered. The young men kept watching, trying to draw her into another round of smirks and quips, but she gave them nothing. No eye contact, no irritation, just the calm detachment of someone who'd walked through far worse storms and no longer had time for noise. She started wrapping her left wrist, her fingers moving with clockwork efficiency. Every turn of the cloth was precise, loop, cross, tuck, muscle memory so deep she could have done it blindfolded in a sandstorm. Her breathing stayed even, her body relaxed, but there was a sharpness in her focus. Not tense, just exact. And then it happened. As she adjusted the wrap across her forearm, the sleeve of her compression shirt shifted slightly, just enough to catch the light. Jake, Tove squinted. What the hell? On the inside of Martha's forearm were thin, vertical marks. Not drawn, not tattooed, but burned into the skin. 9 of them. Each identical in length and spacing. Each a clean, deliberate scar that hadn't happened by accident. Tove tilted his head. Are those... Ryan McCall leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Looks like some weird tattoo. Nah? Derek Stanton muttered. Tattoos don't look like that. I don't know what that is. The 3 of them shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement curdling into confusion. It was hard to explain, but something about those marks made the air feel heavier, like they'd stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Ryan tried to reclaim the moment, injecting mock bravado into his voice. So what's with the tally marks, Grandma? You keeping score of coffee runs? Martha didn't answer. She just kept wrapping her wrist, one smooth motion after another, until the cloth covered the scars again. Her silence wasn't cold. It wasn't even dismissive. It was something deeper than that. It was the silence of someone who'd earned the right not to explain. But the damage was already done. The jokes didn't come as quickly now, and when they did, they landed flat. McCall laughed nervously, but no one joined in. Looks like someone's been watching too many war movies, he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. Tove crossed his arms, trying to look unimpressed. You think she put those on herself? To look tough or something? Derek didn't answer. He was still staring at the spot where the marks had shown through. Something about them unsettled him, not because they were gruesome, but because they were perfect. Too uniform, too deliberate. These weren't the scars of an accident or a regrettable teenage stunt. They meant something. He just didn't know what. Meanwhile, Martha had moved on to her right wrist. Same careful routine, same silence. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. I mean, maybe she was in the field at some point, right? Like back in the day. Sure, McCall replied, forcing a grin. Probably handed out flyers behind enemy lines. But no one laughed. Not even Ryan himself. The gym noise hummed in the background. Clanking weights, muffled chatter, the constant thrum of overhead fans. But it all seemed farther away now. As if some invisible shift had taken place in the space around them. Because what had started as a morning joke was beginning to feel like something else. Something serious. Something they didn't understand. Derek finally muttered what none of them wanted to admit. What if those aren't just marks? Tove looked at him, frowning. What else would they be? Stanton's voice dropped. Kill count. That hung in the air like a dropped rifle. McCall opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. That's not a real thing. Derek glanced back at Martha. She was pulling her sleeves back down now, covering the scars, finishing her wrap. She wasn't looking at them, but somehow it felt like she had seen everything. He swallowed hard. You sure? He said quietly. McCall didn't answer this time. Because suddenly, none of them were. And that was the beginning. Not of a fight, but of a lesson. By the time Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn stepped onto the sparring mat, the sun had fully crested over Fort Emerson's parade line, casting long beams of gold across the polished gym floor. The gym's chatter had dimmed, just slightly, but noticeably. Something in the air had changed since her hand wraps had slipped and revealed those scars. The young reservists still chuckled now and then, but even they could feel it. Still, Ryan McCall wasn't about to back down. Not yet. He swaggered over to the sparring board and grinned as he grabbed the dry erase marker. "Wes, I'll warm up on Grandma," he said, scribbling his name beneath hers. Staff Sergeant Delaney, the gym coordinator, looked up from his clipboard. His stocky frame and sun-creased face gave him the air of someone who'd seen just about everything Fort Emerson could throw his way. He raised one thick eyebrow. "You sure you want to do that, McCall?" Delaney asked dryly. McCall's grin didn't waver. "Seaman Sarge. Light contact, right? Just a little dance." Delaney didn't reply. He just stepped back and clicked his stopwatch into position. Martha stood at the edge of the mat, finishing a series of slow neck rotations and shoulder rolls. No bouncing, no hype, just calm focus. The kind that made veterans sit up and pay attention. Her sleeves were now pulled back down over her forearms, but the memory of those 9 burns was burned just as clearly into everyone else's mind. McCall bounced on his toes like a boxer prepping for a local fight night. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his knuckles, threw a few quick jabs into the air, all flash and theater. "Don't go easy on me now," he called out with a wink. Martha just looked at him. No smile, no sarcasm, just presence. Delaney's voice rang out across the gym. 3 minutes, light contact, begin. For the first few seconds, McCall danced around her, light on his feet, tossing lazy jabs to test her reaction time. He expected her to flinch, to shift, to move in panic. She didn't. Instead, she stood calmly, adjusting her stance with the smallest, most economical shifts of weight. Watching him with unsettling stillness, she wasn't nervous. She was studying. McCall darted in with a sharper jab. Still, Martha didn't move. He circled again, trying to gauge distance. Another jab, this time paired with a quick feint to the left. Still nothing. He was growing frustrated. She wasn't taking the bait, so finally, he stepped in fast and committed to a right hook. A clean, textbook strike meant to impress the spectators and maybe rattle the old timer. That's when it happened. Martha's body turned slightly. Just a shift of the hips, a precise step forward, and suddenly, McCall was off balance. Completely. With zero wasted effort, she caught his momentum, locked his wrist, and rotated at the waist. Before he knew what was happening, he was airborne. The thud echoed across the gym like a thunderclap. McCall hit the mat hard, the air rushing from his lungs in one violent exhale. He lay there blinking at the ceiling, stunned. The gym had gone silent. Delaney didn't say a word. He just clicked the stopwatch. 1 throw. 10 seconds in. McCall sat up slowly, rubbing his back, a dazed grin on his face. "Lucky shot," he muttered. But even he didn't believe it. The second round began, and this time, McCall was visibly more cautious. No showboating, no bouncing, just focus. He tried to close the distance with a low shoulder charge, hoping to use his size against her. But Martha sidestepped with quiet grace and caught his lead foot with a sweep. He went down again, clean, fast, and harder than before. Before he could scramble away, she dropped a knee gently but firmly on his chest, while her hand twisted his wrist into a lock that forced his entire arm to seize with pain. "T-tap," he said quickly, slapping the mat with his free hand. She released him immediately and stepped back without a word. He rolled to the side, red-faced and gasping. No more bravado, no more quips. What he had just experienced wasn't luck. It wasn't show, it was expertise. It was control, and above all, it was earned. Tovey and Stanton stood motionless at the edge of the mat, expressions blank. Moments earlier, they'd been smirking and cracking jokes. Now, they just looked small. Delaney scribbled something quietly on his clipboard and gave McCall a quick nod. "You're done," he said flatly. "Hydrate and stretch. Don't be stupid." McCall didn't argue. He got up slowly, with the care of someone who had just been reintroduced to gravity. He sat by the water cooler, towel around his neck, breathing deeply. And as he looked across the gym at the woman who had dismantled him in less than 2 minutes, he finally asked, in a hushed voice, "Who the hell is she?" No one answered yet, but something told him he was about to find out. The sound of Ryan McCall hitting the mat still lingered in the air when Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn calmly stood up and adjusted her sleeves. She didn't gloat, didn't even look at him. She simply stepped off the mat with the same unhurried grace she'd walked in with, as though taking down a man half her age in under 2 minutes was just another part of her morning routine. Around the gym, people had stopped moving. Weights that had been clanking minutes earlier now sat untouched on racks. Jump ropes hung motionless in athletes' hands. The stereo speakers in the far corner still played, but even the upbeat rhythm felt somehow out of place in the charged silence that had taken hold. The three reservists, McCall, Tovey, and Stanton, sat in stunned silence. The shift on their faces told the full story. What had been amusement was now caution, maybe even awe. They had come into the gym looking to prove something, to each other, to themselves. They'd seen Martha as a symbol of the old guard, a relic, a joke. Now, they weren't so sure she wasn't the most dangerous person in the room. Across the floor, a young female specialist had paused mid-set, her eyes locked on the woman who had just dismantled one of Fort Emerson's loudest weekend warriors. Two senior NCOs leaned against a rack of medicine balls, arms crossed, watching with the kind of slow nod that veterans reserved for moments of unspoken respect. No one was laughing now. No one dared. It was clear that Martha Quinn didn't need to speak. Her silence had already said everything. There's a certain kind of stillness that only comes after someone's been humbled. And in military gyms across the country, that moment tends to echo louder than any locker room bravado ever could. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was reverent. And it wasn't just the young men who noticed. Staff Sergeant Delaney, clipboard still in hand, didn't say a word, but his eyes followed Martha as she picked up her water bottle. He'd run this gym for over 3 years and seen his share of fakers and hotshots. But this was different. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't proving a point. She was simply being who she'd always been, quiet, capable, and utterly in control. He recognized it. So did others. In one corner of the room, a lean, older sergeant with graying temples leaned toward his junior. "You see that throw?" he muttered. "Yeah," the younger soldier whispered. "Didn't even look like she was trying." "That's because she wasn't," came the reply. "That kind of movement, you don't get that from training videos. That's field work." From behind the counter, Corporal Eddie Palmer now sat a little straighter. He replayed her name in his head again. Martha Quinn, it was nagging at him. He'd definitely heard it before. But where? Meanwhile, on the bench near the water cooler, McCall sat rubbing his shoulder, trying to figure out what had just happened. His ego had taken the brunt of the fall, not his body, and that stung more. Tovey leaned close and muttered under his breath. She didn't even break a sweat. "I know," McCall whispered. "I've sparred with guys from Delta. None of them moved like that." Derek Stanton didn't say anything. He just stared across the gym, watching Martha reset her hand wraps with methodical calm. That's when it hit him. "She didn't come here to impress anyone," he said quietly. The others looked at him. "She came here because this is what she does. Not for show. Not for fun. It's who she is." That realization settled like a stone in their chests. The next names were called on the sparring roster. 2 younger enlisted men took the mat, looking awkward and hesitant. One of them even stole a glance in Martha's direction, as if silently asking permission. Martha, for her part, sat near the edge of the room, legs crossed, sipping from her canteen. She didn't interrupt, didn't insert herself. But the energy in the gym continued to orbit around her, as though she'd become the quiet center of gravity that everything now revolved around. Even the air seemed different, cooler, stiller, like the gym itself was holding its breath. Respect, it turned out, didn't always arrive with medals or announcements. Sometimes it came in silence, in one throw, in a locked wrist and a man twice her size tapping the mat like a new recruit. And that silence carried further than any victory yell ever could. In military life, there's a truth most don't speak aloud. You never really know who someone is until you see how they move under pressure. Bravado fades. Boasting burns out. But grace under fire, that stays. And today, a room full of soldiers, young and old, loud and quiet, learned that Martha Quinn, the woman they'd laughed at, wasn't a joke, a relic, or a paper soldier. She was the real deal. And from that moment on, no one would ever mistake her for anything less. The gym's atmosphere had settled into an almost eerie calm, the kind of quiet that didn't come from exhaustion, but from realization, from the sudden, collective awareness that something, or someone, was far more than she appeared. Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn sat on a bench near the back wall, quietly rewrapping her right wrist with the same care and precision that had defined her every move that morning. No eyes were on the sparring matches anymore. Every glance, every half-whisper, drifted toward her. But she didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't shrink. She didn't need to. And then the door hissed open. The pneumatic seal gave way with a soft release, and Major Kendall Hayes stepped inside. At 54, Hayes was the kind of officer who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His uniform was regulation clean, not parade crisp, but functional, lived in. The crease in his trousers spoke more of field experience than inspections. His clipboard rested under one arm, a pen clipped to the top, but his eyes weren't on the paper. Not yet. They were scanning the room. He noticed it immediately. Something was off. No music, no banter. The air felt weighted, the way it sometimes did before a storm or after a surprise inspection that no one had prepared for. His gaze shifted from the half-frozen group of sparring observers to the water cooler, where Ryan McCall sat with a towel around his neck, massaging a shoulder that had clearly been introduced to the floor harder than he'd expected. Further off, Jake Tovey leaned against the wall like someone trying to disappear, and Derek Stanton stood completely still, his expression unreadable. They all looked younger now. Smaller somehow. And in the center of it all, quiet, unmoved, was the woman seated on the bench, adjusting her compression sleeve with slow care. Hayes turned to Staff Sergeant Delaney, who stood near the equipment room watching the scene with arms crossed. "What's going on here, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, voice low but carrying. Delaney handed over the clipboard without taking his eyes off Martha. "Had an unexpected addition to the roster," he said. "Signed herself in. Claims she was cleared." Hayes nodded as he scanned the names, flipping once, then stopping. His pen paused over one entry. "Quinn, Martha L." He blinked once, then again. His jaw shifted just slightly. Delaney noticed. "You know her, sir?" Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up and studied the woman across the room. Really looked. She was sliding the wrap back over her wrist now, her sleeve pulling up just a bit during the movement. That was when he saw it. The marks. He froze. It wasn't the kind of reaction most people would notice. But anyone who had spent time in the darker corners of command, the parts that didn't make the after-action reports, would have recognized the flicker of recognition that moved behind his eyes. 9 tallies. Each burned clean and deep into the skin. Uniform, deliberate, not tattoos, not ink, but scars. And not just any scars. Hayes had seen those marks once before, years ago. In a sealed briefing on off, the book's operations that officially never happened. The kind of work that didn't get medals, didn't get newspapers, and didn't even get whispered about in most command tents. But Hayes remembered. He remembered what those burns meant. They weren't decorations. They were records. Kill counts. Etched by fire, because tattoos could fade, blur, or be erased. But heat fire left no doubt. It was the signature of a unit so far off the grid that even most colonels never heard the name. Echo teams. Deep recon. Denied at every level missions. Zero attribution. Hayes stepped forward slowly, carefully. Behind him, McCall, still rubbing his shoulder, called out, forcing a little chuckle. "She's got those marks all over her arms, sir. Like some kind of warrior monk." The words hit the air, but they didn't land. Not this time. Hayes turned to the young man, his voice cutting through the room like a knife through burlap. "Do you boys have any idea what you're looking at?" The question was soft, but it didn't feel optional. McCall opened his mouth, closed it. Tovey blinked, his confidence visibly draining. "What, they're not fake?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. He turned back to Martha, who now met his gaze. Not confrontationally, but directly, professionally, like two people who had seen the same deserts, the same silence. He nodded once. "Mind if I ask where you're stationed these days, Sergeant?" "Civilian contractor," she replied. "Reinstated about 8 months ago. Off-grid." Hayes exhaled slowly, nodding. Puzzle pieces were falling into place. "They finally cleared your paperwork." She gestured slightly around the room. "Enough to walk through a door like this." He turned to the others. "The marks you were joking about," he said clearly, letting the weight settle in his tone. "Those aren't tattoos. They're not some tough guy design out of a movie. He paused, scanning their faces. Each one represents a confirmed elimination, on missions that don't exist in any file you'll ever see. They were used by Echo teams operating under rules most of you wouldn't understand. Rules written in blood, not briefing packets. The gym was dead silent. Not even the treadmill belts were humming anymore. Hayes nodded toward Martha. She ran point for Echo 9. Deep insertion. Non-attributed missions. You think you got a workout this morning? That woman has more confirmed enemy kills than most infantry companies see in a year. The words hung in the air. No one moved. No one dared. Martha finished her wraps and quietly zipped up her bag. Still silent. Still not boasting. Because she didn't need to. Major Kendall Hayes stood in the middle of Fort Emerson's gym, clipboard tucked under one arm, his voice firm but composed. But what he said next would leave the entire room changed. Each of those marks, he said, nodding towards Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn, as a confirmed elimination, not from some sanitized record in a file cabinet, not from drone footage or distant commands. No, those were done up close. On the ground, in places that don't exist on your training maps. The weight of his words pressed down on the gym like gravity had shifted. Across the room, McCall, Tovey, and Stanton didn't speak. They didn't move. The casual arrogance that had defined their morning had been peeled away like old paint in a storm. They looked younger now, not just in age, but in awareness, in how little they understood the world beyond their brief service. She was part of a reconnaissance unit, Hayes continued, Eco 9, deep field ops. Insertions with no support, no extractions, and no backup. If something went wrong, they were already written off. These were missions where only two outcomes existed: complete the objective or disappear. A stunned silence settled. She's not some administrator who wandered into the wrong gym, he added. She's the reason people like you get to serve in comfortable bases with working air conditioning. Because people like her already went first. Hayes looked back at Martha, who had resumed her seat near the wall, calmly adjusting the strap on her duffel. Her expression hadn't changed. She hadn't flinched. She wasn't reliving anything. She wasn't basking in the moment. She was just present. That, more than anything, unnerved them. You know why those marks are burned in and not inked? Hayes asked, his voice quiet but direct. Because out there ink fades, tattoos get infected. But fire leaves a mark that no terrain, no weather, and no enemy can erase. It's permanent, just like what she did. Stanton swallowed hard. But sir, those kinds of missions don't exist. Hayes finished the thought for him. Exactly. Which is why most of you have never heard of them. That's by design. Tovey's voice was barely above a whisper. So what is she doing here? Why now? Hayes turned toward them, his tone shifting from explanation to lesson. She's here for the same reason any real soldier comes back to the mat. Because this isn't about ego. It's about staying sharp. It's about discipline. It's about making sure that, if the worst happens again, if something breaks and she's needed, she's not rusty. He looked them over. You boys thought you were testing her. Turns out, she just gave you the most important education you'll get in uniform. Tovey looked at the floor. Stanton sat on the bench, elbows on knees, hands clasped tight. McCall just stared at Martha, trying to reconcile the two versions of her. The woman they had mocked as a paper soldier, and the warrior who had dismantled him without breaking a sweat. And the truth hit like a punch to the chest. They'd misjudged everything. Around the gym, the silence remained. Nobody dared pick up weights. Nobody turned the music back on. Even the other trainers and junior officers kept their distance. It wasn't fear, it was respect. Martha hadn't said a word to defend herself. She hadn't needed to. Hayes watched them carefully, then said, You ever wonder what keeps people like her going? After everything they've seen, after the things they've done that no one's allowed to acknowledge. They didn't answer. It's not glory, he said. It's not medals. It's not even rank. It's the mission. It's the people next to them. It's knowing that somebody has to carry the hard things, so others don't have to. He looked back at Martha one last time. And some carry more than others. Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn finally stood up. She shouldered her duffel with the same quiet grace that had become her signature. No nod, no smirk. Just a brief glance toward Hayes, one professional to another. Then she turned toward the door. Before she reached it, Hayes called out, still sharp, "Quinn." She paused, half turning her head. "Rust," she said, her voice calm, "was never the problem," and then she was gone. The door hissed shut behind her. No one moved for a long moment, because what had happened inside that gym wasn't just a sparring match. It wasn't a lesson in hand-to-hand technique. It was a lesson in character, in respect, in how easily we misunderstand the people we think we know, and how dangerous it is to underestimate quiet strength. For McCall, Tovey, and Stanton, the morning wasn't just humbling. It was unforgettable. After Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn stepped through the gym doors and vanished into the morning light, silence reigned inside Fort Emerson's training hall. No one moved. No one resumed their workout. Even the treadmill screens dimmed from inactivity, as if the machines themselves sensed that something sacred had passed through the room. A story, a warning, a revelation. Major Kendall Hayes stood still, his arms loosely folded across his chest, watching the three young reservists who had, just an hour earlier, chuckled at a woman they didn't know. Now they couldn't even meet each other's eyes. McCall sat hunched forward on the bench, his towel still around his neck, face flushed not from exertion, but shame. Tovey leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, jaw clenched. Stanton sat perfectly still, staring down at the gym floor, as if searching for something he'd lost. What they'd lost was certainty, and what they'd gained was something much more valuable. Hayes took a few slow steps toward them, his voice quiet, but unmistakably firm. "You boys learned something this morning," he said. "The question is, are you going to carry it with you? Or file it away as a funny story you tell over beer someday?" The three men looked up slowly. He didn't wait for an answer. "In this line of work, you never know who you're talking to," Hayes continued. "That admin clerk pushing papers. She might have dragged wounded off a ridge in Kandahar under direct fire. That cook in the mess hall could have survived 3 IEDs before they gave him a ladle." He paused. "And that woman you laughed at, she was a ghost. One of ours, operating so deep in the dark that not even half of Central Command could find her if they tried." The gym remained still. Even the ceiling fans hummed a little softer. Hayes looked each of them in the eye. "You need to understand something. The most dangerous people you'll ever meet won't be the ones shouting about it. They don't need to. They've already lived it. And if they're quiet, it's not because they're weak. It's because they don't owe anyone an explanation." He let the words hang. "You thought you knew what a warrior looked like," he continued. "But warriors don't always come in tight uniforms and hard stares. Sometimes they come in with frayed sleeves, weathered faces, and eyes that have seen more than you'll ever want to." McCall rubbed his palms against his knees, the bravado long gone from his posture. "She never said a word," he murmured. "Not once. Not even when we mocked her." "She didn't need to," Hayes replied. "She knew who she was. She didn't come here for your approval. She came here to stay ready. That's what real service looks like. No fanfare, no applause." Tovey finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many more like her are out there?" Hayes shrugged. "More than you'll ever know. That's the point. They don't walk around with medals on their chests or stories on their lips. They carry their service like a stone in the pocket. Quiet, heavy, always with them." He paused. "You just happened to see one today." In the corner of the gym, Staff Sergeant Delaney had resumed his clipboard duties, but even he worked with more stillness than before. He scribbled notes, nodded to the next sparring pair, but his eyes kept drifting back to where Martha had stood. Something about the way she moved had left a mark, not a wound, but a reminder. Hayes stepped back, giving the young men space. "You want to be ready for real service," he said. "Then start by learning the first rule of respect. Assume everyone has a story you don't know. Assume everyone earned something the hard way. And assume the quietest voice in the room just might be the one who saved a dozen lives in the dark while no one was watching." McCall nodded slowly. It was the first genuine movement he'd made since being thrown to the mat. Hayes looked satisfied, not pleased, but satisfied. Like a teacher who had just witnessed a lesson land where it needed to. He glanced toward the door where Martha had exited and gave a subtle nod, as if honoring a soldier whose work still echoed, even after her boots had left the floor. Then he turned to leave, pausing just before he stepped out. "One more thing," he said without turning back. "Next time you think you've got someone figured out based on how old they are, or what they wear, or how soft their voice is, remember Martha Quinn." He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes hard but fair, "and remember those marks on her arms." With that, he disappeared into the hallway. The gym remained still for a long moment. Eventually, someone picked up a towel. A pair of sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. A jump rope resumed tapping the mat. But it wasn't the same. Something had changed. It wasn't just how they saw her. It was how they now saw the people around them. The quiet ones. The overlooked. The ones who kept their heads down and their stories hidden. And maybe that was the lesson all along. That the strongest among us don't need to be heard. They only need to be seen. The door had closed with a soft pneumatic hiss behind Staff Sergeant Martha Quinn, but the weight of her presence still lingered. Inside the gym at Fort Emerson, the silence wasn't just heavy, it was transformative. It felt like the air itself had changed, as if something sacred had just passed through the room and left behind not a storm, but a stillness too deep for words. No one moved for a long time, not because they were stunned, but because they were thinking. Truly thinking. Martha hadn't said much, not even a full sentence to defend herself. No lectures, no explanations, and certainly no need to prove anything. But she had taught an entire room something most of them would never forget. Her footsteps echoed briefly down the hall, fading into the base's morning rhythm. Radio calls, trucks idling outside, someone running PT laps in the distance. But here, inside the gym, the world hadn't quite restarted. Ryan McCall, who only an hour ago had cracked jokes and flexed for attention, now sat in silence. His towel hung limply around his neck. He looked at his own hands, the same hands he'd thrown a punch with, and slowly curled them into fists, not out of anger, but realization. Jake Tovey leaned against the far wall, eyes unfocused, lost in thought. Derek Stanton still hadn't spoken a word since Hayes had left. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was sobering. Because the lesson was no longer about Martha Quinn. It was about them, their assumptions, their immaturity, their idea of what strength looked like. They had laughed at the wrong person. And now they knew it. On the clipboard by the front desk, Martha's name still sat at the top of the sparring roster, written in small, neat letters, the kind of handwriting that came from writing reports in foxholes or in dark tents with red light pens. Functional, precise, just like her. Corporal Eddie Palmer looked at it now and realized something strange. He'd never once seen her reach for that pen. Had she brought her own? Had she signed in before anyone even noticed? Or had she always been there? The thought gave him chills. As the minutes passed, the gym slowly stirred again. Weights were lifted. Conversations resumed, softer now, more restrained. The kind of shift that doesn't show up in reports, but lives quietly in the way people walk, the way they glance, the way they choose their words. It was the kind of transformation that could only happen when someone reminded you that you don't know everything. Especially not about people. Especially not about those who don't speak loudly. Out in the parking lot, the morning sun had begun to climb higher, stretching long shadows across the asphalt. Martha Quinn walked toward her truck, a nondescript government-issued vehicle like 100 others on base. No stickers, no vanity plates. No signs that a legend had ever stood behind the wheel. She moved with the same quiet grace as before, duffel over one shoulder, boots stepping softly, not needing to hurry, not needing to explain. She didn't look back at the gym. She didn't have to. Her work was done. Not the kind of work that gets tallied in promotions or medals, but the kind that changes the trajectory of other people's thinking. The kind of work that reminds a soldier, or a civilian, that not everything that matters is visible on the surface. Not every scar is loud, not every hero is recognized, and not every warrior comes with a battle cry. Inside, McCall finally stood and walked to the mat where she had fought. He knelt down, ran his fingers along the vinyl, and shook his head slowly. "We never stood a chance. he murmured. Tove joined him, quieter now. You think she's done? McCall looked up. No, he said. I think she's always ready. That's the difference. Later that afternoon, Hayes was seen walking toward operations headquarters, but not before stopping by the gym once more. He didn't say much, just glanced at the now clean, matte, the silent board, and the faces of 3 young men who had learned a lesson that would follow them far beyond Fort Emerson. When asked later if he planned to file a report, Hayes simply said, "There's nothing to file. Just a reminder." A reminder of what? He paused, then smiled faintly. That the most dangerous people in the world are usually the ones who never have to tell you how dangerous they are. Have you ever looked at someone, based on their age, their uniform, their silence, and assumed they were less than they truly were? What would you have done if you'd seen those burn marks on her wrist? Would you have known what they meant? Or would you have laughed, just like they did? There's something powerful about silence. Not the kind that comes from shyness or fear, but the kind that comes from experience, from discipline, from surviving things you never talk about, because talking was never the point. Martha Quinn didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wear her record on her sleeve. But when it mattered, her actions spoke for themselves, louder than any boast, stronger than any medal. And in that gym, 3 young men, and everyone watching, learned a lesson they'll never forget. You never really know who someone is until it's too late to take back what you assumed. The woman you dismiss as too old might be the one who could save your life. The man who sweeps the floor might have once held a command you'll never read about. The most dangerous people in the world aren't loud. They don't need to prove anything. They've already done it in places that don't show up on maps. So before you laugh, before you judge, before you label someone as less than, pause. Look deeper and listen, especially to those who say very little. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's wisdom, it's strength. And it's the reason you still get to speak freely today. Have you ever misjudged someone? Have you ever discovered someone's quiet strength long after you made up your mind? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if this reminded you that some heroes walk quietly among us, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, respect isn't given to the loudest voice. It's earned in silence.